We begin our worship service acknowledging that the land on which we meet is the traditional homeland of the Dakota peoples. Seeking to be good relatives, our congregation has committed to ongoing and intentional work with Indigenous peoples to restore relationships and accept the responsibility for the work of reparations. The words of the chalice lighting can be found on your pew cards. Let us say together the chalice lighting. We are a welcoming people of diverse beliefs who commit to nourish the spirit, broaden the mind, nurture the earth, and build community. May this flame we kindle remind us to strive today and every day to love beyond belief. Our UU heritage of religious freedom comes from the lives of those who came before us. Anne Hutchinson is considered one of our UU ancestors, though she was an English Puritan. A highly educated, religiously confident woman, she was banished by the leaders of the Boston, Massachusetts colony for holding different religious beliefs, contrary to the Puritan religious and government leaders. Exiled in the 17th century for dissenting beliefs, 4 centuries later, a few steps from the UUA headquarters in Boston, a statue of Anne Hutchinson stands on the State House lawn of Massachusetts. The reading this morning is from Alandria Williams, Honoring Our Ancestors. The history and legacy of Unitarian Universalism are shaped by the ancestors in our congregation. I came as a 4th grader to my congregation, the Tennessee Valley Unitarian Universalist Church in Knoxville, Tennessee. That community helped bring me into social justice struggles in the world around me and inside the UUA. My church opened so many doors because they held young people in high esteem and encouraged our leadership in the church and community. My religious education teachers, friends, parents, and spirit aunts and uncles were and still are community leaders in everything from nuclear disarmament to anti-racism and anti-oppression issues. They have been my inspiration as I work to support others who are called by their faith to change hearts, minds, and communities. My church changed forever on July 27, 2008, when an armed man came into the sanctuary and killed 2 UU leaders, one a member of our church and the other a member of Westside Church. This rocked our church to its core. When I first heard about it, I didn't know who had been killed. My mom, my friends, their parents, or others who had nurtured me my entire life. I realized something that day that has stayed with me ever since. No matter what issues I have with other Unitarian Universalists regarding our visions of God, spirit, justice, race, age, at the root of everything is community. No matter what issues I have with other Unitarian Universalists, at the root of everything is community, love, and faith. That day, something larger then our individual beliefs rose up in my mind. I thought of the principles, values, and family that are the connective tissue of our faith, and that held us weeks after the shooting. 6 months later on, we celebrated our 60th anniversary as a church. We are part of the connective tissue that holds the legacy and the future of our faith. We are the children of freedom fighters, visionaries, and radical liberal theologians. We are the phoenix rising out of the ashes of the McCarthy era and the civil rights, women's, and queer liberation movements. We wear our faith as tattoos on our bodies and in our hearts as testaments to the blood, tears, dreams, and inspirations of our community ancestors and elders. And now I welcome Ann Hutchinson to our podium, banished from Boston.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm really Liz Kipp, as you all know. I'm reprising a talk I wrote and presented 9 years ago on the life of the English Puritan Anne Hutchinson in the early 1600s. I became interested in Anne Hutchinson for 2 reasons. Number 1, I grew up in a town called Seekonk on the Massachusetts state side of the state line with Rhode Island, in the area where Anne Hutchinson came to her fame by being banished from Massachusetts and going to live in Rhode Island. Today, I acknowledge that the land there was stewarded for many centuries by the Wampanoag, Narragansett, and other indigenous peoples who were there before European arrivals brought deadly microbes to which they had virtually no immunity. Reason number 2, a little more fun. My own mother's name was Anne Hutchinson. My mother actually was born in Ireland, and I doubt that my grandparents would have heard of the old English-American Puritan Anne Hutchinson when naming their 4th daughter. But just over the Rhode Island line from Seekonk in Portsmouth, there was an elementary school bearing the name Anne Hutchinson School. It was a great source of drive-by fun for my parents and me when I was a child. I can still hear my dad chuckling, hey, look, Ann, as we were driving out to sightsee along the water or go out to dinner. The old Anne Hutchinson's life touched on difficult questions of spirituality, politics, the role of women, and deadly encounters between indigenous people and the European arrivals in North America, which may be why she never was covered in my public school or Sunday school classes as I half expected over the years. Old Anne's story is hard. It is not child-friendly. There are many other historical figures of more importance and influence for us to look to, but I still think that the name coincidence with my mom is pretty cool. Plus, I imagine that the old Anne Hutchinson may have walked across land where my friends and I played as children. So I'm presenting to you all the school paper that never got assigned. I need to give credit up front to 2 writers whose books I've used. One is Yves Laplante, who wrote American Jezebel, The Uncommon Life of Anne Hutchinson. Another is Michael Winship, who wrote The Times and Trials of Anne Hutchinson. I have those here with me today. First, here are the basic facts of her life. Anne Hutchinson was born in 1591 in the town of Alford in Lincolnshire, England, about 125 miles northeast of London. She has been variously described as a religious enthusiast, a crusader for religious liberty, an early feminist icon, a witch, and that American Jezebel. Her father was a Puritan clergyman, Francis Marbury. In 1634, aged around 43, Anne emigrated to North America to the 4-year-old Massachusetts Bay Colony centered in the new city of Boston, along with her husband William Hutchinson and their 11 children. The English Puritans of Boston, Massachusetts were not the same folks as the English separatists we call the Pilgrims, who had settled south of Boston at Plymouth around 10 years earlier, although of course they knew each other. In Boston, Anne was respected for her skills as a midwife and nurse and for her intelligence and religious fervor. She held meetings in her home, attended by both women and men, to discuss recent sermons and scripture passages. She was critical of many of the ministers in the colony, accusing them of preaching a covenant of works. That was a very offensive accusation at the time. The Boston community became divided between her supporters and the supporters of most of the ministers, including the colony's first governor, John Winthrop. This conflict was called the Antinomian Controversy, which is the first thing you'll see if you look at Anne Hutchinson's Wikipedia page. And there will be a quiz on this at the end. In November 1637, Anne was tried and banished by the Massachusetts General Court, although she was allowed to stay in Boston for the winter. Her husband and several supporters acquired land and planned a new colony on Aquidneck Island in what is now the town of Portsmouth, Rhode Island. In April 1638, Anne walked from Boston southwest to Rhode Island. It took her 6 days. Today it would be an easy 1-hour drive on Interstate 95. I like to imagine that she and her party crossed the spot where I grew up in Seekonk on the state line, east of Providence. In 1642, after the death of William, and fearful that Massachusetts Bay would take over Rhode Island, Anne and her youngest children moved further again to the Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam in what is now the Bronx borough of New York City. There, in the summer of 1643, she and most of her household died in a struggle with indigenous groups there over land rights. Several of her older adult children remained in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. Anne's descendants eventually included several U.S. presidents, and I would bet at least one or two of you here today. So that's the quick overview of her life. She lived a fortunate life in many ways. First, she chose her parents well. Her mother was Bridget Dryden, a cousin of John Dryden, who would become England's poet laureate. Bridget was known for her midwife skills and passed these on to Anne. Her father, Francis Marbury, had the leisure when Anne was young to spend time on her education, concentrating on Bible reading and his own record of Puritan zeal. When Anne was a teenager, her father was assigned to a parish in London, just across the river from Shakespeare's Globe Theater. I like to imagine the Puritan Anne sneaking out to go to the theater, which of course was disapproved of by good Puritans. At age 22, Anne married William Hutchinson. He and his family were Puritans and successful textile merchants from Anne's home village of Alford. William and Anne returned to Alford and started a family. They had 14 children between 1613 and 1634. Anne and William had the means to be choosy about where they attended church and which Puritan preachers they listened to. Some of the ministers in the area received training years earlier from Anne's father. After some years, they settled on a church in the town called Boston in Lincolnshire, pastored by the Puritan John Cotton. Anne used her nursing and midwifery skills and held meetings in her home to discuss sermons and scripture, as she would continue to do in later years in America, providing comfort and confident religious assurance to her community. Her healthy, wealthy, and frequently growing family would have been seen as admirable results of Puritan purity. So how did this Englishwoman, who appeared to have almost everything, come to trudge in exile through cold marshes and woodlands on the North American coast in 1638, perhaps over the same ground my friends and I happily played on? Well, before Anne was born, her clergyman father had been removed from churches he served at least 3 times by Church of England bishops. He had also been tried by a church court in London, convicted of heresy, and imprisoned at the infamous Marshalsea prison. The Church of England was in more or less constant turmoil with dissident Puritan clergy at that time in the late 1500s. When Anne was very young, her father spent several years under house arrest. This was why he had so much time to spend educating his daughters. Some of their reading material was from Francis's own heresy trial. To understand what Puritans were about, it's important to know that the Church of England had separated from the Catholic Church mainly for the English King Henry VIII to get control of the Church's power structure and property in England. Think Thomas Cromwell and Wolf Hall. That was back in the mid-1500s. Changes in the religious life of ordinary people did not come until later in England. Church and state were still a single entity. Threats to the established Church of England were seen as political threats to the English nation, whether from people who seemed too Catholic and content with very traditional religion, or from the mushrooming Protestant groups like Calvinists, Familists, Presbyterians, Quakers, Anabaptists, Separatists, and Puritans. Puritans were just one group, but they became the most powerful in England for a time. Their aims were to purify the Church of England from within, to make it more acceptable to God, and to keep control strictly in English hands. They made selective use of Bible verses, of course, to justify their beliefs. Puritans opposed the bishops who administered the Church of England. There were lots of things Puritans didn't approve of, like colored glass, decorations in churches, harmonic singing, pagan celebrations like Christmas and Easter. And I'm not joking about their opposition to celebrating Easter. But the hostility between Puritans and bishops was an on-again, off-again kind of conflict, which probably explains why Anne Hutchinson's Puritan minister father was able to go from parish to prison to parish to house arrest, and finally to the rather lucrative London parish where he finished out his life just before Anne got married. Now at this point, I was thinking about talking about the religious concept called predestination, which Puritans adopted from Calvinist Protestants, but I'm not going to do that to you all today. Let's just say that changes during these years in both religious beliefs and government power were big drivers of history, and they interacted a lot. A highly educated, religiously confident woman, such as Anne Hutchinson, could easily become a target if she disturbed government authority. So around the 1620s, Puritans in England were becoming restive again. They resented the newest king, Charles I, because they thought he was too friendly to the Catholic Church. Puritans began to use imagery from the Bible to claim that God was about to destroy England for consorting with the Antichrist. A well-funded group of Puritans formed the Massachusetts Bay Company and planned a colony in North America, a New England, as it were, that would be ruled by a church system more acceptable to God. In 1630, around 700 Puritans, including the colony's first governor, John Winthrop, crossed the Atlantic. As the first wave of Puritans was leaving Old England in 1630, Anne and William Hutchinson were still living their comfortable life in Lincolnshire, north of London. But later that year, an outbreak of bubonic plague killed about a quarter of the population of their village. Anne and William lost 2 daughters in the outbreak. Puritan ministers in the Hutchinson circle began to hide and then emigrate to Massachusetts Bay. Still in England in 1633, Anne gave birth to her 14th child. Soon afterwards, Will sold his textile business. In 1634, the entire family sailed for America on the Griffin, arriving in Boston 10 weeks later. They built a house among other leading families there on the Shawmut Peninsula, including the governor, John Winthrop. Will and Anne were accepted as members of the Church of Boston. Both had to testify that they had experienced saving grace and were thus elect. And this is all about predestination again, sorry. Although Anne's acceptance at the church was a bit delayed, she was rumored to have claimed for herself direct revelations from God during the voyage to America. So Anne quickly resumed her roles as nurse, midwife, and leader among the women in the Boston community, as she had done in England. Facing life and death every day with her outspoken belief that assurance of free grace, again, this is predestination, could be experienced by the elect, such as she herself claimed to have done. She provided support and inspiration also to a growing number of both women and men. She accused many of the colony's ministers of preaching the erroneous covenant of works. Here then was the rift that became known in Boston as the Antinomian controversy. New colonists were arriving all the time. My sense from reading is that the newer colonists tended to lean towards Anne Hutchinson's covenant of grace views, while the earlier colonists needed to exert control out of fear that the colony might not survive. Roger Williams, a Puritan clergyman himself, was banished from Massachusetts in 1636, less than 2 years after Anne and William Hutchinson arrived. He became the main founder of the Rhode Island colony. Massachusetts Bay was also preparing for war. The colony sent men to fight in the Pequot War in Connecticut in 1637. There were anti-war sentiments among Anne Hutchinson's supporters, and this did not sit well with the earlier colonists who wanted military action. In early 1637, several Boston ministers in the Hutchinson circle were tried and convicted of sedition, which consisted of making offensive religious accusations against other ministers. These opened the way for trying Anne Hutchinson herself, which there may have been some reluctance to do, in the hope that she would just disavow her claims. Anne Hutchinson was 46 years old when the General Court put her on trial in November 1637. She was in the early stages of her 16th pregnancy. She had given birth to her 15th child, Zuriel, in Boston a year and a half earlier. There is no particular passage from the trial transcript that illuminates really what was going on. It was shadowboxing with Bible verses over these issues of predestination with which I promised I would not belabor you all. But Anne was assertive in her own defense. She claimed many biblical passages authorizing the teaching of women and defending the revelation she claimed to have received from God. At one point, I believe even her own minister, John Cotton, made some statements that threw her under the bus, anachronistically speaking. After 2 days, the trial ended with these words from Governor Winthrop. Mrs. Hutchinson, the sentence of the court you hear is that you are banished from out of our jurisdiction as being a woman not fit for our society and are to be imprisoned till the court shall send you away. In April 1638, Anne walked south to Aquidneck Island, where the elementary school which so fascinated me would be located in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, 3 centuries later. Her 16th pregnancy came to an end. It had been a molar pregnancy. Her opponents back in Boston seized on this as God's punishment on the woman they believed to be a heretic. Portsmouth is a lovely community in Rhode Island, just north of Newport, with expensive homes, ocean views, and the seafood restaurants my mother loved. I like to think Anne and William and their family lived happily there for a few short years. The seeds of church-state separation were growing there. The Hutchinsons are even thought to have considered anti-Trinitarian religion. But the proximity to Massachusetts Bay was still a threat. So after Will's death, Anne and her 6 youngest children moved on to what they thought was the relative safety of the Dutch settlement at New Amsterdam, now New York. Religious conflicts in the colonies would go on for many decades after Anne's death. Some of Anne's followers became Quakers and members of other religious groups who suffered severe persecution. Back in Old England, Puritans got control of Parliament, engaged in civil war, and beheaded King Charles I in 1649. Puritan control of England lasted only until 1660, 11 years of puritanical rule were enough for England. Let's hope. Switching back to New England, colonists went to war with remaining indigenous people in the very bloody conflict known as King Philip's War in 1675. In the 1690s, the Salem witch hysteria came and went just north of Boston. And although Massachusetts Bay never got control of Rhode Island, it did succeed in taking over a different colony in 1691, my southeastern corner of New England, including Plymouth Rock, where the name Old Colony, this or that, adorns many buildings and businesses. There's been a statue of Anne Hutchinson in front of the Massachusetts State Capitol building in Boston since the 1920s. She would not have approved, but I think my mother liked it. Anne was formally pardoned by the governor of Massachusetts in 1987. Now, last time I gave this talk, I closed with the traditional sounding piece from our own gray hymnal. Today I'm trying something different. Diane and I discussed this and decided Jean Levette would have approved. So remember I told you there'd be a quiz on the antinomian controversy? Well, meet antinomian Barbie. Thank you all.
Let us extinguish the chalice. The words are on the pew cards. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.